Let's talk now about looking at the welfare impacts of a tariff. And we'll use this, we're going to use the standard way of measuring consumer welfare. We're going to think about consumer surplus and producer surplus to measure producer welfare. We'll be able to think about deadweight loss. We'll be able to think about the tax revenue that goes to the country that imposes the tariff. What we saw in the previous discussion was that we saw that a tariff is going to raise the price of the good in the importing country. That's going to help domestic sellers and hurt domestic buyers. We saw that that tariff lowers the price of the good in the exporting country. That's going to help foreign consumers and hurt foreign producers. What we need to do is quantify how much it helps and hurts. So we're going to think about consumer surplus. We always abbreviate consumer surplus CS, or at least I do. Consumer surplus, remember the definition of it, is willingness to pay minus the price that's actually paid. So we could do a simple example. Let's suppose that you're willing to pay $10 for something, but you only have to pay $4. What that means is that you get $6 of consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is value that you place on the good that you were willing to give up. It's a number of dollars you were willing to give up, but because the price was lower than how much you valued it, you didn't have to give up your full willingness to pay. So we could calculate consumer surplus if your willingness to pay in the example I just gave you was $10 minus, suppose you have to pay a price of $4, your consumer surplus would be $6. So that $6 represents essentially surplus value that you get. You can spend that $6 on something else. We use this as a measure of the willingness, or excuse me, of a measure of the well-being of consumers. Because the bigger consumer surplus is, the better off consumers are. If we always had to pay our full willingness to pay for everything we bought, our standard of living would be much lower. So that's going to be our measure of the well-being of consumers. If we're thinking about transaction of one unit of the good, then the way you calculate consumer surplus is one number minus another. But if we're thinking about a picture where the consumer, or if this was a market picture where all of the consumers are consuming multiple units of the good, or there are simply multiple buyers, each buying one unit. It doesn't matter if these consumers are buying one unit or multiple units each. If we think about a picture like this, where our price is somewhere down here, and we look at the total quantity consumed, then what's happening is, if this was a single consumer, then this consumer is buying all of these units represented along that demand curve. Or if this was a market demand curve, there are multiple buyers that are buying all of these units. So if we want to calculate consumer surplus for multiple units, we know that it ends up being an area under the demand curve and above the price. Remember, the demand curve is a value curve. It represents consumers' willingness to pay. So if we take willingness to pay, which is the demand curve, and we subtract off the price that actually is paid, then this area right in here ends up being consumer surplus. So if we're transacting one unit of the good, consumer surplus is one number minus another number. If we're talking about multiple units of the good, consumer surplus shows up as an area under the demand curve and above the price. Let's think about producer surplus. So producer surplus is equal to the price that is paid by the good to the seller minus the cost of production. So if a seller is paid $20 for something and it costs them $7 to produce, they got $13 of producer surplus. So if there's one unit of the good being transacted, it's one number minus another. If there are multiple units of the good being sold by either one seller or multiple sellers, remember our supply curve represents the cost of production. In a competitive market, the supply curve is simply a marginal cost curve. So the supply curve represents the cost of production. If we had a price that's being paid right up there, then we know that here's the quantity that's being bought, and our producer surplus shows up as all of the area under the price and above that supply curve. So this area down here would represent producer surplus. If we put those together, I've treated these separately. What you should know already is that for this to be the price, our supply curve would be coming down through here. And for this to be the price, our demand curve would be coming down through here. Let's put it together and just talk about what a market looks like with demand and supply together. And you've seen this before. Here's our demand curve and our supply curve. Our equilibrium price is going to end up being right there. Our equilibrium quantity end up being right there. All of the area under the demand and above the price is going to be consumer surplus. The area under the price and above the supply curve is producer surplus. Typically, we're not really that concerned about consumer surplus versus producer surplus. A lot of times what we're interested in is just total surplus. And so total surplus, some textbooks call it economic surplus, is just consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So total surplus would be all of the area under the demand curve and above the supply curve. Now when we talk about international trade, it is going to be a little bit more interesting to talk about consumer surplus versus producer surplus, because a lot of the motivation for countries to establish a tariff or some other type of policy is going to be to protect producers in their country. So what we will see is that there a lot of times will be an increase in producer surplus, and that's going to come at the expense of consumers. So consumer surplus is going to fall, producer surplus is going to rise. So it will help us understand why some groups will be very much in favor of tariffs while others would be very much opposed to tariffs. So now that we've kind of reviewed consumer surplus and producer surplus and we've seen total surplus, now we can go back and look at the effect of a tariff and we can see exactly who's going to be helped and who's going to be hurt. So I need to clear this off and then we'll take a look at that. Let's go back now to the picture of the tariff imposing country. We don't need to draw the home market and the world market and the foreign market, because we know now the effect that the tariff is going to have. It's going to drive price up in the tariff imposing country, not by the full amount of the tariff. It's going to drive price down in the country that is exporting. So we can just focus on the importing country, its market. So let's draw kind of a big picture here. We've got our price, quantity, demand, supply. This is the importing country, so let's make sure we label this. This is the country that imposes the tariff. Our world price is going to be clearly below the autarky price here in this country. So the price in the world is going to look like that. We could see the original amount of imports. Here's the amount that domestic sellers are going to be producing. Here's the amount that domestic buyers want to buy. The difference there is going to be the amount of imports into the importing country. So this is what it would look like if there was no tariff. Okay, so we're going to start there. The tariff, we know, is going to drive the price up in the importing country to PT. Now, the tariff is not, this distance is going to be less than the tariff because we know it's going to drive the price down in the exporting country. So their price is going to get driven down by that amount. And this distance right here, that's the amount of the tariff T, the tax. So now let's think about what's going to happen here if price gets driven up to PT. That's going to decrease the amount of imports into this country. Let's just put, here's the amount that buyers are going to want to buy. We could call it D2. Here's the amount that sellers now are going to sell domestically, produce and sell domestically. Call it S2. I'm going to go over, you'll see why here in just a second. I'm going to go over from this price that is going to exist in foreign, and I'm going to draw a little dashed line right there. This area right in here is going to end up being tax revenue, but for the tariff imposing country. We'll talk about that here in a second. Now I want to label some areas. Let's label this A, let's label this B, C, D, and we'll label that little chunk E. So now let's think about the effect that this tariff is going to have on both consumer and producer surplus. So let's start by thinking about producer surplus. Producer surplus, let's think about not the total amount of producer surplus, but the change in producer surplus. So let's call this the change in producer surplus. Producer surplus, remember, is the area under the price and above the supply curve. Before there was any tariff, producer surplus would be this triangle down here. Here's the price, that's the world price, here's the domestic supply curve, so the producer surplus that domestic suppliers would get is this triangle. Once the tariff is imposed, the price rises to PT, supply curve doesn't shift, so the change in producer surplus is going to end up being area A. So producers gain that dollar amount, okay? If we think about, so let's put here that producers are better off. Producers better off by the dollar amount represented by A, whatever the area of that would be. To calculate it on a picture, you can't calculate the area of this, I don't even know what that shape is, some type of trapezoid type thing. What you would need to do is divide it up into a rectangle and this little triangle. Calculate the area of that rectangle by itself, calculate the area of that little triangle by itself, add them together. That would represent the change in producer surplus for producers. Let's talk about the change in consumer surplus. If we look at consumer surplus before the tariff was imposed, that's the area under the demand curve and above the price. Here's the price. So the area under the demand curve and above the price would be all of this area under the demand curve all the way out to here and above the price, PW. Once the price gets driven up by the tariff up to this point, consumer surplus is going to fall to this smaller triangle. So the loss in consumer surplus is going to fall to this smaller triangle. So the loss in consumer surplus is going to be this chunk right down here, A plus B plus C plus D. So the change in consumer surplus, I'm going to put a negative out here and put this in parentheses because this is a loss. It's going to be A plus B plus C plus D. So what we can say here is unambiguously consumers are worse off. The tariff drives the price of this good up. If this was wheat, the tariff drives the price of wheat up. If we look at the change in government revenue, change in government revenue, the revenue that the government earns is going to be the tariff, which we're thinking about this as a specific tariff, a T dollars per unit. So it's going to be T dollars multiplied by the amount of imports with the tariff. Now with the tariff, the amount of imports is D2 minus S2. So for example, if 100 units were imported into the country and there was a $2 tariff, then the government revenue would be $200. $2 times 100. That shows up, T here, this distance between the price in home and the price in foreign, that's T. And this distance right here is the number of imports. So the area of this rectangle right here ends up being the revenue that the government earns from the tariff. So the change in government revenue is going to be equal to C plus E. Change in government revenue. What we want to do is think about the net effect. So some people are helped, producers are helped, consumers are hurt. What we want to do is think about, once we add it all up, what's the end result? Is it positive or is it negative? So we want to think about the net loss due to the tariff. Net loss due to the tariff. So it's going to be the consumer loss. We're thinking about this. We could also phrase this in terms of the net gain from the tariff. In that case, we would take the gains and subtract off the losses. We're going to phrase it as the net loss. So we need to take the losses and subtract off the gains. Okay? We've identified our loss as we've put a negative here, but if we're thinking about the net loss, that's going to become a positive. I know that's a little bit confusing, but that's how every international textbook does it. So it's going to be the consumer loss minus the producer gain minus the government revenue. So our consumer loss is A plus B plus C plus D. That's the loss that consumers experience. The producer gain is A, so let's subtract the gain off from the loss, minus A. Let's subtract off the government revenue, because that's a gain, minus C plus E. Minus C, let's put it this way, plus E, so it's going to be minus C minus E. What that works out to, the end result, the net loss of this is going to be B plus D minus E. Let's identify where those are. So if we look at, this is going to be loss, this is going to be loss, but this little chunk is going to benefit us. So if we identify where those things are over here, the B is this little triangle right here. That is part of the loss due to the tariff. That hurts us. This chunk, D, ends up being right here. This triangle is also part of the loss. So those two hurt us. And then there's this E, which is good for us. That's part of a gain. E shows up as that rectangle right there. So we lose B, we lose D, we gain E. Now in this picture, it makes it look as if the tariff is good for us. But keep in mind, that's just a consequence of how I drew this picture. I just freehand drew the picture and I put my prices here. It depends on how big these two countries are relative to each other, as to how much that determines how much it drives the price up in home and how much it drives the price down in foreign. If I would have made price fall not very much in foreign and rise a lot in home, B and D would have been bigger and E would be smaller. So don't look at this and infer anything about the relative size of these. We would need to actually calculate them in a problem before you know whether this country would be better off or worse off. So what we're going to be left with is the conclusion that the welfare impact of a tariff is going to be ambiguous. It depends on how much these prices change relative to each other. It depends on how big these quantity changes are down here. So let's talk about B for a second. B has to do, that's going to be what we would call part of the deadweight loss. B has to do with the fact that domestic sellers are selling more than they would have at the world price. That's a distortion. Essentially, domestic sellers are being given an incentive to produce more than they should. This tax induces them to produce S2 instead of S1. That's a production distortion. It creates a deadweight loss, and that deadweight loss is equal to that little area B. There's also a deadweight loss that comes from a consumption distortion. If we look over here, area D, in the absence of the tariff, consumers would consume D1 units. Once the tariff is imposed, they consume less than D1. They consume D2. So this tariff induces them to consume an inefficiently low level of the good. And because of that, we get this consumption distortion, a deadweight loss that's due to the fact that this tax incentive reduces the amount of the good that consumers consume. Area E ends up being a gain for this country, and it's a gain because this country's terms of trade actually improve. The tariff improves the country's terms of trade and creates some revenue. So again, whether or not the country is better off or worse off depends upon the areas B plus D compared to area E. Okay? So we've got a consumption distortion, we've got a production distortion, and then we've got this gain that comes from the terms of trade improvement. In the next video, what we're going to do is think about some other trade policies that a country could impose. This is the most basic trade policy, and it works out just like a tax works out in a 1011 class or an intermediate micro class. We tend to see that it creates deadweight loss. Looks a little different in this picture than you're maybe used to. It creates some revenue. But now we need to think about some other policies like export subsidies or trade restraints, things like that. So we'll do that in the next video.